Hello and welcome to yet another interesting conversation, this time a focus chat. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming to you from the Mozaic Works office, from the Mozaic Works studios. And my guest today, coming back from a long uh, time when I missed him, is once again Adi. Welcome, Adi.
Hello again. Thank you for inviting me, and have a good day again.
So, what I thought we would chat about today is something that I think is very interesting for many teams and many organizations. We started getting more requests on this area, in the particular area of agile technical leadership, which sounds a bit weird for people who don't realize that you actually can have technical leadership in agile, and not only you can have technical leadership, but it's also, I would say, very important, if not mandatory, for your success, right? What do you think?
Yeah, uh, I guess it depends on your team, right? Where you're going from, but um, you either have it implicitly, and then you don't care about it because you know you don't care about what's good because you have it already. um, or yeah, when you don't have technical leadership, then you feel the pain. I think that's basically the idea.
Yeah, I think one thing that we need to notice is that if you go through the Agile Manifesto, there's nothing, well, there are only a few things about technical practices or technical leadership and so on. But the reason for that is because the people who wrote the Agile Manifesto were actually very good technical people. So they assumed that everybody will be at their
Like
level.
them, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's true, but I think it also leaves a bit of room because, as we know, some practices change, and what was very useful and interesting 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Let's take Devops, for example. Nobody was talking back then about Devops, but now it's something that you probably want. So I just guess that's another reason.
Yeah. All right. And so maybe the first thing that may sound weird in the title of this video is that it's about something called enabling constraints for agile technical leadership. And this sounds a bit weird. I think many people assume that a self-organizing team just means that if it's self-organizing, it can do whatever it wants, and it doesn't have constraints. And so who are you to come and set constraints? Have you met this attitude in your work?
Um, so I think that people don't understand that we always have constraints, and I think that's where we need to start from. There isn't anything that is without constraints. Of course, people would come and challenge the authority. Of course, well, that happens during any transformation. But also, it's about the constraints they have. So, for example, there's that thing we keep hearing that yeah, the code should have defects, product should have defects. It's a hard life and that's how we live. But that's a constraint. Only that you have lived with it for 10, 15, 20 years, it doesn't mean that it's not a constraint of how you work. It is. You got so used to it, so now you believe that it's just how life is. But in fact, it's just a constraint that you got used to. So probably the problem or the challenge, in fact, is that you need to change the constraints from something to something else.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm thinking that, so one very simple example, let's say you are a completely new agile team, but you are working inside of a bank, right? Chances are you won't be able to develop a video game, right? you are probably living within the constraints of the bank or within the constraints of any organization you work with. And some of these constraints are related to the bottom line, what you need to deliver, but others are about the culture surrounding you, about the uh, management structure, and so on, right? So there's never, you as a team working freely inside the organization and choosing whatever you want to do.
Even going at extreme, when we talk about those self-organized flat organizations that have theoretically, yes, they're self-organized, and when you talk with people who were living or live in these organizations, they say that we are extremely aware of how of how budgeting should be made because of what we need to do. So you start to understand out of a sudden that yeah, you're self-organized, but you have the usual life constraints like budget, time. You need to look at what you need, what's important to work on. You need to understand clients and so on. So you are extremely closer to business because you are self-organized, and then you understand the real life constraints.
Yeah, yeah, and that's actually a good point. I noticed that as teams grow in degrees of freedom, in degrees of autonomy, they also start taking on more responsibility and understanding more about what the organization actually is. Because, in fact, when you are acting as a team in a flat style organization, you are fundamentally a micro company inside the company. So that's why you need to suddenly understand the business of your team and not only the technical stuff or what you are building or the product, or you need to go
Yeah,
much further.
yeah. So you're free. Yeah, you're self-organized. You're free. Let's say so. Just to come up with an example, you work at a you work in an organization. There are, I don't know, 200 people, and everybody can do whatever project with the only constraint that that project needs to be short and it needs to bring some value, so some profit to the company. So only that constraint means a lot. You need to understand what means profit, what means value, how you measure it, how means what means fast, how can you work on it, how we understand what are the needs. It's so complicated already, but it's just one constraint. And you're self-organized, so you can pick up people from the organization and create your team. You need to convince them that it's a good profit.
Mhm. Yeah. However, to go back to, let's say, the most common situation, usually what you have is a number of teams that work on specific products that are assigned on that product by management somehow. Because usually, at least in our domain, when we are called inside larger companies who want to organize in this more agile way. And this means also um, slowly adopting, slowly changing the way they work with projects and products and so on. So usually there's a transition here. So what happens is that we have these teams and they are working on some more or less given requirements. Um, Sometimes they can do more product discovery, sometimes they can do less, but um, the reality is that they work already within a set of constraints.
Mhm.
Um, but there's one thing here that I think is also, and this is the other side of our chat, a concept that I'd like to explain, which is enabling constraints. This is a concept from complex systems theory. And the idea is that you have certain types of constraints that actually enable certain types of evolution inside your organization. So if we are taking your teams as being a complex adaptive system, if you want your teams to evolve or to have a higher chance to evolve, let's say, towards higher quality, fewer bugs, um, faster time to market, uh, I don't know, better performance at operational time, then what you need to do is to set out some of these constraints. This is one way. One way you can use from complex adaptive systems in order to lead teams in the direction that you want, because the teams can go and can evolve into whatever direction, right? This is the nature of these systems, and so having certain constraints is very important, but it's very important to pick those constraints that are enabling the teams to evolve into the right direction, not constraints that are blocking the teams from getting better. And so these concepts are very important for understanding what it means to lead agile teams in general, but also to lead on the technical side. And I think it might be better to come up with a few examples. So which would be some practices that we think can help teams, let's say?
Yeah, typically I try to start from the problem. The problem are requirements. So you can have practices like refinement or specification by example, or acceptance driven development. These types of practices that help you understand requirements better as a whole team.
Yeah, and I think that that makes a lot of sense in many uh, teams, because what I've noticed is that there's a law in software development: garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
If your requirements are not good enough, then you won't get a good product out of it. But also, it's a problem of knowledge, because you need to transfer this knowledge and to process it, to refine it to the point where you can actually write code that works. And so this specification by example is a constraint, because any practice that is mandatory or that becomes part of the work of the team becomes a constraint for the team, right? They will not do any specification, or they will not start any user story without using this particular practice. But at the same time, it's enabling them to understand faster what needs to be done, right?
Yeah, and also it takes place, or it takes the place of the existing practices, which were typically working in silos, passing on big analysis documents, having this way of sheltering devs or testers or suppliers from the business knowledge as an implicit way of working. And then with this way of working, with refining together as a team, you start replacing the old practices with a new practice. So in a way, you're changing the constraint from only the analyst is allowed to analyze to all the team needs to analyze.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Right, and perhaps people listening now are wondering, okay, but what does, talking about analysis have to do with technical practices? Because we are talking about technical leadership.
So it has to do because a programmer, when writing the code, in a very, let's say, classical approach, would write exactly the code that the analyst would tell them. I put in this, write this algorithm here, then put in this class these three things, put that table with exactly these table names and exactly these constraints here, and then the tester will know exactly the test case, what to do, and would basically be a human who runs a scenario and repeatedly. Changing this approach means that you will need to be an analyst and tester, an analyst and a programmer, and sometimes an architect and an analyst and a programmer, because some of these changes need to or impact other systems, or you need to understand how they impact those systems and what's the change of the architecture, and if that's a good thing. So there you go. You start needing many skills, which you acquire because you are faced with these new challenges.
Yeah. And in addition to that, so one example of such practice is behavior-driven development, right? Which many programmers assume that it's a way of writing automated tests or a framework for writing automated tests. It's not. We have a few videos on this channel about what BDD, behavior-driven development, is actually about, and it's about analysis, about discovering those cases that and discovering them together within a small team, an analyst, a developer, a tester, coming together and figuring out, what are we missing, what are we actually trying to do, and what are we missing from the information that we have. And writing these tests is just a byproduct in the end. The main outcome is understanding what you're doing.
Yes, so as Liz Keogh says, or Dan North, or so people who Chris Matz who are involved in BDD from the beginning, they say that the most important things are the conversations, and in this way you have this knowledge that you build, and then you might want also to write that knowledge in a form, and the best form is automated tests to have executable specification. Of course, that's something not easy to do in the beginning, but once you start understanding how to have these conversations, what questions to ask, it's a learning process. After a while, you start having better and better results. And you need to start, that's another effect of this type of constraint. You need to start thinking, let's say that usually you work in a silo like a programmer, and you need to start thinking a bit like an analyst, a bit like a tester, a bit like an architect. And the effect is that you start having T-shaped individuals because you need to acquire those skills in a way.
Yeah, and so you see what I was talking about, that by setting out this constraint, every requirement that you have must pass through a BDD session. Let's say a BDD, I think it's called, well, a conversation, let's say, just to keep it simple. And at the most, we can also automate as tests, because sometimes you cannot automate everything from those conversations.
Or you don't want to.
Or you don't want to. But as much as we can automate as tests, and because you are setting out this constraint, it goes into two directions. It enables the team to move faster because they weed out any misunderstandings very quickly, and because they start building this test suite that is focused on actual user scenarios rather than technical concerns. And it enables the team to evolve, and the individuals in the team to evolve towards a place where they can help the team better. So it's the whole concept of enabling constraints in a nutshell. This is what it's all about.
Yeah, okay. Let's take another example which I find interesting, which is very, very common now. I was thinking about this. Using Devops. So why, we start using Devops. That's a constraint. Now, before that, we were deploying by hand, or we had some script, whatever, but now we want to have a pipeline. So we want a continuous integration system, a continuous deployment system, and we want to have a pipeline. As far as I know from these big uh, journals like Harvard Business Review and so on. It's a huge impact only on the industry scale when big companies, big organizations started implementing DevOps. So it means something like 20-30% of less operational cost, which for a huge company means quite a lot. So that's interesting how you go from this to profits and to changing also behaviors.
Yeah, and let's not forget that DevOps is actually more about the culture. I know many people focused on DevOps as being the pipeline and the automated tools and so on. Those are great. Those are enabling constraints for the actual culture. And the culture is, let's put in production as fast as we can whatever we have. Uh, this is the main culture of DevOps, right? It's about things like you build it, you run it. So enabling the teams. What was happening in the past? I worked in such organizations. So I would get a task as a programmer, and then I would start writing code, and then I would finish the code, and I would say, yeah, I'm done with the task. And sometimes 1 year later or 6 months later, some poor guy would put this in production or would start testing it. And when they would start testing it, uh, they find bugs, and some of the bugs are in the task that I wrote, in the code that I wrote for the task, right? But those bugs were never coming back to me. They were coming back to the team or maybe to other people who are doing maintenance and so on. So I had no way of learning what I was doing in that code was actually not that good, right? No way of improving as a programmer. And the only way of improving as a programmer was to kind of meditate on on code and read a lot and so on. But when you reduce this feedback cycle and when you put the team in charge with, you have all the tools necessary, you just click this button or run this command, and your software, your code is going to be live in a few hours or in an hour or in 10 minutes or in 5 minutes. It would be great if it would be in a matter of minutes. And then you start getting, reports. Oh, that doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and that doesn't work. The first time is annoying, but you learn so much more. So I think one of the things why this is such an enabling constraint, besides the fact that it optimizes the deployment and you avoid errors in deployment, you avoid configuration issues and all these kind of things, but it also enables very fast feedback from the team for the team, which allows them to figure out what to do better, how to improve, how to write their code better, how to make sure that they don't forget certain things when they do the deployment and so on. So these are very important things, and this, by introducing DevOps, you not only save a lot of money by automating things and saving a lot of time on deployment and all these things, but you also gain something that is less tangible, and that is this feedback loop, short feedback loop that once again enables your team to grow in a good direction.
Yeah, and the idea of you build it, you run it also means that you're more responsible. Otherwise, as you said, I wrote the code, I don't know, whatever. I wrote the code, that was my job to write it. I won't change it, someone else will. So as long as you say you build it, you run it, you are responsible for writing the code, making sure it's good, making sure it can be deployed, making sure the architecture is fine, making sure there are enough test scenarios, making sure that it makes what you should do for the business and so on. So it's it brings a lot more responsibility to the team, and that's why I think this is a very this idea with DevOps is a very powerful enabling constraint.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we've noticed in teams that were starting to work within this model is that some of the developers got very interested in infrastructure and in automating infrastructure. So they would start being the actual DevOps people who are writing code for infrastructure, maybe not full time, maybe just part time, from time to time. You need to do this. And this is also great on a personal level because as programmers we are very different. We like very different things. And personally, for example, from my side, I actually love infrastructure. I find it fascinating. I don't know why, but it quite fascinates me. And I've seen a lot of programmers who also find this very appealing. And suddenly they can learn more, they can feel better, and they can also contribute with a lot of useful things to the team and the organization. It's win-win-win for everybody.
Again, you have to shape individuals.
Yeah,
Again, the same thing. So people start understanding other things. Developers start understanding about operations. Maybe testers understand more about development and development about testers and so on, because I need to, if you say, do you build it, you run it, you need to make sure that you validate your work, and you need to know how to do that.
okay, let's take another example. So DevOps is a kind of a big one,
Yeah.
and it's quite obvious, I would say. It's been discussed a lot. Let's talk about things like clean code.
Mm-hmm.
And just to clarify, when I'm talking about clean code, I'm talking about a specific set of rules that are written in the book clean code, so it's not a general, you know, uh, whatever you imagine kind of things. It's about those rules, writing small methods, writing classes with fewer methods, following cohesion and so high cohesion and low coupling in whatever you do, giving good names. These are just a few of the rules. There are much more. Um, so what happens if you try to write every line of code or for every task, keeping in mind these rules?
Yes, it's very interesting that when I'm talking to people about this, they say that the code starts being more intentional, um, or something like we don't need that much code review because it's easier to understand. The we need to understand the business more, because if you need to use a term concept, you cannot use anything. You need to use a business term, and then you need to understand which business term. So with this process, you need to understand the business, and in that moment, you start having the business related to the code. It's very interesting that business analysts in that moment can read the code, because it's written like, yeah, okay, there's some weird things there, weird, I don't know, commas and arrows and parentheses, but as long as it's written with only with business domain names, anyone who knows the domain can read it and can give feedback even on the algorithms. So during let's say you, and in this way you won't need necessarily to have a review done by a programmer. You can also have a review done by a business analyst, or someone who understands the business, which starts being very interesting, and it relates with the other practices that we talked so far.
And if we are here, I would like to mention one indicator that you can actually measure today in your code. And it's called cyclomatic complexity. If you are measuring one indicator, I noticed that this is one that correlates highly with places where you have bugs, or you are likely to have bugs. So if you have a psychomatic complexity greater than 7, uh, or greater than 10 if you want to go to, let's say, to be more brave, then you will find that those places tend to have more bugs. Now, of course, depending on the tool, this indicator doesn't always give you, I mean, you still have to look at the code and figure out if it's really a problem or not, because some tools find switch case statements and think that those are have a high psychomatic complexity, and it's not the case. I mean, it is the case, but it's not hard to understand what's happening usually in those places. But it will find the places where you have a lot of embedded ifs or conditionals in loops into other conditionals and things like that, and that those tend to be very difficult to understand, right? And one idea in clean code is to remove as much as possible these constructs.
Yeah, because where you have defects, more defects will appear. And if you simplify the code, the idea is that you'll have less defects because it's simpler, so you understand what to change, and everything becomes easier.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about clean code as an enabling constraint in the sense that you can, by starting to adopt clean code and saying, okay, every new piece of code that we write will follow these rules. As you mentioned, you start learning more about the domain, you start learning more and linking your code more to the domain. What does this mean? It means that your code is more easy to understand, and not only by you, but also by other people. And then you can figure out easier if certain things don't match, because it's one thing to talk about the variable, I don't know, x factory or something like that, and a completely different thing to talk about a bank account. Those two have meaning. The second one has meaning, and then you can link this meaning in your code with other things and see if they make logical sense together, right? So you can actually eliminate a lot of bugs by following some of these rules, and just good naming will get you very, very far.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a difficult topic. I mean, naming it's important and difficult.
Yeah, obviously, yes. So we talked about clean code. Let's talk a bit about, we mentioned automated tests, but let's go even further. Let's talk about test-driven development. What happens with teams who are using test-driven development to write all the new code? It's a completely different thing, by the way, if you want to write tests on existing code. I know many people confuse those. These are two very different practices that have some similar things inside them, but we are just talking about test driving all the new code. What happens with teams who do that?
It's very interesting that you have test-driven development in the name, but in fact the main purpose here is having a good design. Simple, and the simplest design for the problem. You have, as an output, what happens is that you have a far simpler code, less code. Less code means less defects typically, means less review, means less errors, and also you have tests to prove that code, which are a byproduct of the whole process, which is in a way weird because it's called test-driven development. And after a while, you see that teams who work like that, or who have worked like that for a while, in fact, are looking at problems in a different way. are trying to understand examples, are trying to understand to put, that they're asking a lot more questions so that they can understand how to start off these tests that they need to try. So you have a lot more, um, you will have, I guess, a lot better refining session, yeah, as an interesting outcome. But also you will have a lot of um, more, you'll have more tests that prove your code that can be run instantly. So basically these tests are tests that run in memory, so you can validate your code extremely fast, that in milliseconds. So that means having, yeah. So that these are probably some interesting effects of the TDD approach.
Yes, and I would add once again, feedback changes everything. An interesting thing about having fast feedback from very fast tests is that you can actually experiment with changing the code in whatever way you want. And many times what I noticed is that once people have these tests in place, and if they are designed in a proper way, which means there is also a discussion here, you need to design your tests so that you can actually change the code. If the tests are very coupled with your code, then there's a bit of a problem there. But if you manage to decouple your tests from the code as much as possible, then what you have is the ability to experiment very quickly inside your code with different approaches, with, I don't know, performance optimizations, with trying out other patterns, or adding a new feature, or recombining existing features into a new feature that is required, and so on. And so feedback changes everything. This this is one of the reasons why after you've done test-driven development for a while, you start understanding more about the design of your code, about your domain, but you also start understanding more about, you start being more open to experimenting and trying out alternatives to the designs that you tried in the past. And this is a good thing because it allows you to come up with innovative solutions. And so you can have, uh, once again, an enabling constraint, something that enables your team to move in directions that you perhaps wouldn't expect in the beginning by setting a constraint. Right. All right. So I think we've touched on the most interesting examples. There are much more to talk about.
Yeah, we can talk all day and also tomorrow probably. And we'll be tired, but I think we can manage to talk for a few days about this type of constraints.
Yeah, because we can talk about, there are many other practices that are enabling constraints, like pair programming, mob or ensemble programming, or as Zul told us in the previous video, he would prefer it to be called team programming. So uh, these are other types of practices that are, let's say, on the more social part of technology, that are also enabling constraints because they enable teams to communicate, to work better together, and so on. And you can go even further with things like usable software design, and with uh, adding specific or creating a design system for your product. Much as you use for UIs, you can do the same for your software design. And those are also constraints. And these are things that we've experienced in teams, and they actually work really, really well. So, but I guess the conclusion is constraints are not always bad.
Quite the
Constraints
opposite, I would say.
constraints always exist. Um, you can pick some constraints that enable teams to move forward, and this is the art of leadership for self-organizing teams, and in particular of technical leadership for self-organizing teams.
So I guess a leader, that's what I typically like to say. A leader chooses constraints, while a manager would just wait, uh, wait there for the person, for the people they're managing to make sure that they're doing what they should do. While a leader would set constraints and maybe inquire about what's going on, give feedback. That would be probably a big difference when we talk about business agility and self-organization.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Although, well, some managers are also leaders, some managers are not.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Like two qualities. You need both, I guess. But if you have only one, it's kind of difficult to have this self-organized team.
All right. Anything else you'd like to add? I think we've come to quite a nice rounded conclusion.
I think we only touched on a few technical constraints, but you need to think about everything around you. It's something that can be an enabling constraint. You can think about um, the way you're working. Let's say, I don't know, you use dailies or you use plannings. That's a constraint. Let's say that you want to, you put a constraint on yourself to eat healthy. That's a constraint, and it will enable something, hopefully. So everything that you think, in this way, it's a constraint, and it will change you and or your system, the system where you work in. Or if you look at bigger organizations, it will change the whole organization. So instead of thinking that we are forced to do something, let's think about the constraints that we have, and let's see if we can change those constraints that aren't helping us with other constraints that will help us. Not helping.
Yeah, I agree completely. Thank you so much, Adi. It was great having again a focus chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so that's it for this topic, enabling constraints for agile technical leadership. Um, we have to pay our dues to the YouTube algorithm, so please like, share, subscribe, tell other people about this, leave a comment. If you want us to chat about a specific topic, if you have questions, it doesn't have to be a refined topic like this. We also answer questions from friends and from whomever chooses to ask us questions. If they are interesting and they repeat, we may pick your question for one of the next focus chat. Thank you so much for watching. Check out other videos from this channel. We have videos related to the Devops culture with Andrea Damovic. We have videos on BDD with Liz Keogh and Thomas Sundberg. So there are much more things that you can check out. Also, I'm very proud this week we managed to launch the new mosaicworks.com website, which I think looks much better and reflects much better what we do. We would appreciate a visit and a comment, a feedback. Just let us know on Twitter what you think, or as a comment to this video. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.